Rain hammered the parking lot below, but Marcus Reed wasn't paying attention to the weather. He was staring at the monitor in front of him, watching the third-floor corridor where a nurse was reviewing a patient chart. This was his world now. 12 hours every shift, 5 nights a week, seeing everything, but being seen by no one. He'd been working security at Cornerstone Medical Center for 2 years. 2 years of checking perimeter cameras at the top of every hour. 2 years of walking the East Wing at midnight and the West Wing at 2 in the morning. 2 years of logging every entry and exit in the system with meticulous detail, keeping the building safe through sheer presence and attention. Marcus was 36 years old. He'd been raised in a family that believed in work, honest work, steady work, the kind of work that didn't make you rich but kept you afloat. His brother had believed that too, right up until his brother needed the hospital to believe it as well. That was 7 years ago now. 8 years since he'd become guardian to his nephew Darius, when his brother died in a county hospital waiting room, waiting for care that came too late, a protocol issue they'd said, a transfer delay, a system that wasn't designed for someone like his brother. Marcus had learned from that. He'd learned that institutions have rules, and those rules serve some people better than others. So when he took this job, this invisible job, this essential but unacknowledged job, he decided he would know every rule, every protocol, every system. He'd bought a notebook, small enough to fit in his uniform pocket, and he'd started writing things down. Hospital protocols, management theory, life lessons, emergency procedures, the way power moved through the building, the way decisions got made about who mattered and who didn't. Nobody had ever asked him about the notebook. Nobody had ever asked him about anything, really. The doctors walked past his booth without a glance. The administrators forgot his name on the schedule. Richard Walsh, the director of operations, had once referred to security staff in a board meeting as replaceable overhead. Marcus had heard about that comment 3 weeks after it happened. He'd never mentioned it, but he'd written it down in his notebook. The building ran because Marcus was present, because he noticed things, because he paid attention to the details that kept people safe. The camera angles, the lighting, the blind spots, the patterns of movement through corridors. 2 years without a single incident. 2 years of excellence that was so invisible most people didn't even know it existed. Beside him at the desk, Tommy Green bought Marcus coffee one evening. Tommy was 22, white kid from the suburbs who'd gotten the job because his uncle knew someone on the board. But unlike most kids who got handed positions like that, Tommy actually cared. He noticed things. He asked questions about why the protocol was what it was. "You think that guy's actually going to die out there?" Tommy had asked once, watching security footage of a homeless man huddled under the east entrance awning. "I think protocol says it's not our concern," Marcus had answered, which wasn't the same as saying he was okay with it. Marcus's salary was $3,400 a month. Rent on his apartment was $1,200. Darius's school tuition was $400. Utilities, food, car insurance, phone emergency savings, that was another $800. That left him with maybe $400 a month of actual breathing room. And that was only if nothing broke. If the car didn't need repair. If Darius didn't need new glasses. If the apartment didn't have issues. He thought about this every single shift. Not with resentment exactly, but with a kind of persistent awareness. This job was his lifeline. This invisible, unacknowledged, essential job was the only thing between his nephew and the foster system. Darius was 8 years old now. Smart kid. Too smart sometimes. He'd learned to read his uncle's stress the way animals read weather. When Marcus came home tired, Darius would be quieter. When Marcus came home worried, Darius would ask fewer questions. The boy understood on some cellular level that his safety depended on his uncle's stability. Marcus understood this too. It was the first thing he thought about on every shift. Before protocol, before rules, before anything else. Victoria Stanton had been appointed to the Cornerstone Medical Center board 3 months ago. She was 52 years old, white, with the kind of bone structure that suggested a life where people had opened doors before she had to ask. Her office was on the second floor of the administrative building, overlooking the hospital grounds, floor-to-ceiling windows, modern furniture, the kind of office that communicated power through its emptiness. Nothing unnecessary, nothing personal, nothing that suggested a life outside of professional achievement. She'd spent 3 decades climbing through corporate hierarchies. She'd learned that sentiment was expensive. She'd learned that feelings were liabilities. She'd learned that institutions function best when you remove the human element from decision-making and replaced it with data, with metrics, with clear financial incentives. When she'd been appointed to the Cornerstone board, her first act had been to review the hospital's operational costs. Within weeks, she'd identified what she saw as the problem: too much compassion, too many uninsured patients being admitted, too much charity work that the hospital was absorbing at a loss. Her solution had been Protocol 427. The idea was elegant in its simplicity. Uninsured patients presenting at the emergency entrance without verified insurance or identification should be directed to county emergency services, not admitted to Cornerstone. This would reduce the hospital's liability, improve its financial metrics, create appropriate incentives for people to obtain proper insurance before they needed emergency care. The board had approved it unanimously. Richard Walsh, the operations director, had implemented it with enthusiasm. Within 2 months, the number of uninsured emergency admissions had dropped by 60%. Within 3 months, the hospital's margins had improved noticeably. Victoria had felt satisfaction about this. The kind of satisfaction that came from identifying a problem and solving it. From understanding that systems worked best when people followed rules, and rules worked best when they were clearly enforced. She was watching the hospital grounds from her office window when the rain started that evening. Not particularly interested in the weather, just aware of it the way you're aware of the news in the background. Present, but not requiring her attention. She watched the rain intensify, watched the streets below begin to flood. She made a mental note about the hospital's emergency protocol for weather events, then turned her attention back to the financial reports on her desk. Victoria had no children. She'd never had time for that. She had moved through relationships the way some people move through cities, never staying long enough to be inconvenienced by attachment. She measured her life in achievements, in titles, in the respect of people who understood power the way she did. She was good at her job. That was what mattered. Protocol 427 occupied a single page in the hospital's operational manual, printed in 10-point font, easy to reference, clear in its language. Unregistered individuals presenting at the emergency entrance without verified insurance or identification are to be directed to public emergency services. Under no circumstances should hospital resources be allocated without prior authorization from the attending physician or operations manager on duty. The protocol had been distributed to every staff member. Trainers had walked people through its implementation. Financial incentives had been established for departments that maintained low uninsured admission rates. Penalties had been made clear for violation. Richard Walsh, the director of operations, was 55 years old, white, and had built his entire career on the principle that institutions function through discipline and compliance. He'd read Protocol 427 when Victoria had proposed it. He'd understood its elegance immediately, and he'd implemented it with the enthusiasm of a man who'd finally found a structure that made sense to him. Sarah Price was the nurse manager in the emergency department. She was 45, white, had been working in hospitals for 23 years, and found Protocol 427 deeply troubling in ways she couldn't quite articulate to her supervisor. She believed in helping people. She'd gone into nursing because of that belief. But she also had a mortgage, 2 college-age children, and a job that was increasingly fragile in a healthcare landscape where compassion and profit rarely aligned. So when the protocol came down, she'd implemented it. She'd trained her staff on it. She'd made sure it was followed. And she tried not to think too hard about the people who didn't get care because of it. Tommy Green had different questions. He'd asked Marcus one night, "Why do we have a protocol that tells us not to help people?" Marcus had thought about this carefully before answering. "Because institutions aren't designed to help people," he'd said finally. "They're designed to sustain themselves. The helping part is what happens when someone breaks the rules." Tommy had frowned, not satisfied with this answer, but understanding it was true anyway. The protocol worked because people like Sarah implemented it, even when it conflicted with their values. It worked because people like Richard enforced it without question. It worked because people like Victoria had designed it in a way that made it seem logical, inevitable, just how things were done. It was one page. It was clear it was killing people. But nobody talked about the second part. Darius was 8 years old now, and he understood more about the world than most adults did. He understood that his uncle was tired. He understood that money was tight. He understood that the apartment they lived in was one emergency away from becoming unaffordable. He'd learned these things the way children learn the most important lessons. Not through being told, but through living inside them, absorbing them the way soil absorbs water. Marcus had become Darius's guardian 3 years ago, when his brother had died. The death itself was complicated. A mixture of inadequate medical care, a system that didn't prioritize poor people, and a kind of institutional indifference that was so normalized it was hard to even call it cruelty. It was just how the system worked. Marcus had been 33 when Darius became his responsibility. He'd been working different jobs, day labor, warehouse work, night security, somewhere else. When he got in the position at Cornerstone, he'd thought it was stability finally arriving. A job with benefits. A job where his work was clearly valued. A job that meant he could keep Darius. Could keep him in a decent school. Could keep trying to be the kind of uncle his brother would have wanted him to be. The apartment was small. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom. A kitchen barely large enough for 2 people to exist in simultaneously. But it was in a neighborhood where the schools were better. And that mattered. Darius had turned 7, then 8, and become the kind of child who noticed things. When Marcus came home stressed, Darius would try to make himself smaller. When Marcus came home late, Darius would already be trying to figure out what he could do to help, what he could make less complicated. This was the thing that kept Marcus up at night more than any financial calculation, the weight his nephew was learning to carry. There was a woman named Elena. She was 35, worked as a nurse at a different hospital, had kind eyes and a laugh that sounded like something genuine in a world full of performances. Marcus had met her at a community event, had gotten to know her slowly, had felt something warm developing in a part of his life that had been closed off since Darius had become his responsibility. But he couldn't let it fully bloom. He couldn't commit to someone when his entire life existed on the edge of financial catastrophe. Couldn't ask someone to entangle themselves with a man who was one job loss away from everything falling apart. So he'd kept it casual, friendly, a relationship that never quite became a relationship. Elena had stopped asking when he'd last had a day off. She'd learned that his calendar revolved around Darius's school schedule and his work shifts. She'd learned that Marcus lived a kind of life that didn't leave room for other people, no matter how much he might want there to be room. Marcus went to church when he could. The community there understood struggle, understood what it meant to work hard and still not have enough. Understood that faith wasn't about prosperity, but about dignity, about holding on to your sense of self-worth even when systems were designed to make you feel worthless. His notebook was filled with things he was learning. How to be a better guardian. how to keep moving forward when everything felt heavy, how to maintain integrity when institutions made it so expensive, how to explain to an 8-year-old why life was the way it was. He was good at his job at Cornerstone. Excellent, actually. But he was invisible while doing it. And that invisibility, while it kept him safe, also meant that no one would fight for him if something went wrong. That was something Marcus understood completely. It was something he thought about every single night. It started at 11:15 p.m. Not gradually, but suddenly. The way November storms sometimes arrive. The rain came in sheets, wind-driven and heavy. The kind of rain that turned sidewalks into rivers within minutes and made the temperature feel colder than it actually was. Marcus was in the security booth when it started. He watched the monitors, watched the rain intensify across multiple camera feeds. The east entrance always vulnerable because of poor drainage and a narrow awning that did almost nothing against wind-driven weather was already starting to look like a danger zone. Water was pooling. The concrete was slick. Inside the hospital, the impact would be coming soon. Weather like this meant more emergency calls. Accidents, people slipping, weather-related injuries. The staff would be preparing, putting on extra hands, cancelling non-emergency procedures. The hospital would shift into crisis mode, even though it was a foreseeable crisis, even though they'd known the weather was coming. Marcus watched the monitors and thought about the protocol, about how it would be applied tonight, about how people without insurance would be arriving in an emergency room that was now explicitly designed not to help them. He had no way of knowing that this night, this specific night, with this specific rain and this specific storm would become the moment that changed everything. He just sat in the booth monitoring cameras and thought about the weight of systems. The radio crackled at 11:42 p.m. It was Brenda Cole, the receptionist, and her voice had that particular quality of someone who'd already decided what the answer to a question would be before she asked it. "We've got a situation at the east entrance," she said. "Looks like a homeless male, probably intoxicated. You want to deal with it?" Marcus leaned toward the monitor. The east entrance camera gave him a clear view, and what he saw made him sit up straighter. The figure wasn't sitting, wasn't even leaning, was lying completely flat on the concrete, face turned to one side, body utterly still. "He's down," Marcus said into the radio. "Not moving." "So call the cops," Brenda replied, her tone suggesting she'd already moved on mentally to other things. "Or just leave him. He'll get up when he gets cold enough." Marcus didn't respond. He grabbed his flashlight and jacket and stepped out of the booth. The hallway leading to the east entrance was empty, the fluorescent lights giving everything that sickly yellow hospital glow. That made everything look slightly worse than it actually was. Marcus pushed through the double doors and stepped into the rain. It was colder than he'd expected. Colder and wetter, the rain immediately soaking through his uniform jacket, making his clothes stick to his skin. He was only outside for about 30 seconds to reach the man, and already the cold was becoming a presence. Something with weight and intention. The old man was lying on his side, arms pulled tight against his chest. His clothes were soaked through, a thin jacket that might have once been brown, pants torn at the knee, shoes that had lost their laces long ago. His white hair was matted flat against his skull, and his skin had taken on that greyish tint that Marcus recognized from his time in emergency rooms during his brother's illness. That wasn't the color of someone sleeping it off. That was the color of someone whose body was shutting down. Marcus crouched beside him and put 2 fingers against the man's neck. The pulse was there, but faint and irregular. The man's lips were cracked and slightly blue. His breathing came in shallow, stuttering waves, like his body was forgetting how to do this essential thing. "Sir," Marcus said, shielding the man's face from the rain with his own body. "Can you hear me, sir? I need you to open your eyes." The man's eyelids fluttered. His mouth moved. But no sound came out. Marcus looked back toward the emergency entrance. Through the glass doors he could see the intake desk, the bright lights, the empty chairs. He could see Sarah Price sitting behind the triage counter, scrolling through her phone. He keyed his radio. "I need medical out here," he said. "East entrance, elderly male, unresponsive, possible hypothermia." The radio was quiet for a few seconds. Then Sarah's voice came through, and Marcus could hear the decision in it before she even spoke. "Is he a patient?" she asked. "He's a person lying on the ground," Marcus said. "Does he have ID, insurance card, anything?" Marcus looked at the old man. No wallet, no bag, nothing but a human being dissolving in the rain. "No," Marcus said. "Then call 911, Sarah said. Her voice was professional, careful, the way people sound when they're delivering news they've already decided about. "We're not equipped to take in unregistered individuals. You know the protocol, Marcus." Marcus did know the protocol. He'd read it 3 times. Page 47 of the hospital manual. Highlighted in blue in his notebook. Unregistered individuals presenting at the emergency entrance without verified insurance or identification are to be directed to public emergency services. Under no circumstances should hospital resources be allocated without prior authorization from the attending physician or operations manager on duty. He knew the protocol. He also knew what hypothermia did to a man who was already this close to the edge. He knew that an ambulance would take 20 to 30 minutes in this weather. He knew that 20 to 30 minutes might be 15 minutes too many. But he also noticed something else. The old man's hands. The fingers were thin, long, no calluses from manual labor. The nails were dirty, caked with grime. But underneath the dirt they were trimmed neatly, deliberately. It was a small thing, barely worth noticing. Marcus noticed it anyway. It meant something. Some part of his brain understood that this man's situation was different from what his appearance suggested. That under the dirt and the rags and the homelessness there was something else. Someone else. It didn't matter, not for what Marcus had to do next. From her office on the 2nd floor, Victoria Stanton was watching the monitors in the security office on a closed-circuit feed. It was part of her board responsibilities, understanding all aspects of hospital operations, seeing how the systems she'd created actually functioned in real time. She watched Marcus emerge from the security booth. She watched him walk toward the east entrance. She watched him crouch beside the figure on the concrete. She watched him check the man's pulse, saw his mouth moving, understood he was trying to communicate with the unconscious stranger. She watched the radio conversation unfold on the monitor in Marcus's hand, could see his lips moving, could read the protocol response in Sarah Price's body language when she appeared behind the glass doors. Victoria had designed this system. She had approved Protocol 427. She had optimized it for financial efficiency. She had made the decision that institutional survival was more important than individual lives. She watched Marcus kneel in the rain, and she saw a man at a crossroads. She could see written across his face and in every movement of his body that Marcus understood what came next, that he understood the choice he was making. She watched for exactly 5 seconds more, then looked away from her monitor. She looked back at her financial reports. She made a conscious decision not to see any more. She would regret that moment for the rest of her life, though she didn't know it yet. "Did you find out what he was saying?" Richard Walsh's voice crackled through on the radio. He was listening to the exchange somewhere in the building. "Is the man being removed?" "He's being transported," Sarah said. And Marcus could hear the careful language, the way people speak when they're passing truth into acceptable pieces. Marcus was no longer thinking about protocol. He was no longer thinking about rules or consequences or the careful calculation of his own survival. He was thinking about his brother, about sitting in a hospital waiting room, while bureaucrats decided whether treatment was financially justified, about the moment when it became clear that the system wasn't designed to help people like them. He thought about Darius, about his nephew understanding at some level that the world wasn't built for people like them. That safety was always conditional. That love wasn't enough when systems were designed to fail you. And then he stopped thinking. Marcus sat at the monitor desk, the radio in his hand, understanding the choice in front of him with perfect clarity. Protocol path, call 911. Follow the rules, keep his job, keep his apartment, keep his nephew's school, keep the delicate balance of his life intact. The man would likely die. The ambulance would arrive too late, the body would go to the county morgue, and Marcus would continue on, invisible and stable and complicit. Non-protocol path, break the rules he'd spent 2 years learning. Break the system he'd spent 2 years supporting. Take a man to medical care he wasn't authorized to access. Save the man's life. Lose his job. Lose his apartment. Lose his ability to provide for his nephew. Lose everything. He thought about Elena. He could call her. Ask for help. She had money. She had stability. She would probably help him, but he couldn't do that to her. Couldn't create that obligation. Couldn't ask someone to catch him when he was about to fall. He thought about church, about the priests who talked about faith, about what faith meant when you were sitting in a security booth, poor and responsible and terrified. He thought about his brother, about the system that had killed him while making it seem inevitable, about the protocols and the procedures and the careful rules that had meant his brother was just a number, just a liability, just something the system had decided it couldn't afford to save. Darius was 8 years old. Darius would be in the foster system within a year if Marcus lost this job, would end up bounced around, would learn that the people supposed to protect him could be taken away, would internalize that safety was always conditional, unless Marcus could figure out how to show his nephew something different. How to show that sometimes doing the right thing was more important than safety. That sometimes you had to be willing to fall in order to stand for something. Marcus turned off the radio. It was the first time in 2 years he'd violated protocol. It was the first time he'd ever made a choice to break the rules that he'd spent so much time learning. He stood up and walked toward the door. Tommy was watching from across the booth. The young kid's eyes went wide, like he understood exactly what was happening. Marcus nodded once, just a small acknowledgement. Then he grabbed his jacket and walked out into the rain. The rain was heavier now, the wind stronger. Marcus's uniform jacket was soaked through immediately, water running down his face, his shoes sliding on the wet concrete. He moved quickly, not running but moving with purpose. The way someone moves when they've accepted the consequences and are proceeding anyway. He crouched beside the old man again. The pulse was even fainter now, the lips even bluer, the breathing even more shallow. Time was accelerating. Marcus spoke to the man as if he were conscious, as if he could hear. "I've got you," he said. His voice steady despite the rain, despite the fear, despite understanding that he was about to burn his entire life to ashes. "I'm getting you inside." He hooked his arms under the man's body and lifted. The man weighed almost nothing, just bones and rags and a human being that the system had decided wasn't worth saving. Marcus carried him through the emergency doors, past the intake desk, past Sarah Price, whose face showed the exact moment she realized what was happening, into the nearest open bay. He set the man down on a gurney and pulled the curtain closed. Then he went directly to the supply closet. He came back with thermal blankets, saline solution, a blood pressure cuff. Everything the protocol said he couldn't use. Everything the system had decided this man wasn't worth receiving. He wrapped the first blanket around the old man's torso and tucked the second one around his legs. The man's body was trembling violently now, which was actually a good sign. Shivering meant his body was still fighting. Shivering meant he hadn't given up yet. Diane Prescott, one of the emergency nurses, appeared outside the curtain. Her arms were crossed, her expression caught between professional duty and personal conflict. "You can't do this," she said. "He's not registered. We don't have authorization." "He's dying," Marcus said, not looking at her, not wanting to see the conflict in her face, not wanting to be distracted from the only task that mattered now. "And I'm not letting him die because of paperwork." He monitored the man's vitals, temperature rising slowly, pulse steadying incrementally, breathing deepening. The man was fighting. Marcus was going to help him win. From somewhere above in the office where financial reports were being reviewed, Victoria Stanton saw the security footage of a black man in a uniform, completely soaked with rain, standing over an unknown homeless person, providing medical care that protocol forbade. She understood in that moment what she'd just witnessed. She understood that Marcus Reed had just chosen another person's life over his own survival. She understood that he'd done it knowing the cost. She understood that he'd done it because some things mattered more than safety. And she understood finally that the system she'd built was designed to make it impossible to do this. That she'd created a structure where compassion was literally against the rules. That every protocol she'd approved, every financial incentive she'd implemented, was designed to make this moment impossible. She would spend the next hours trying not to think about what she'd just seen. She would fail at that. The hours passed slowly. Marcus stayed with the man through the night. He monitored vitals. He adjusted blankets. He spoke to the unconscious patient the way Sarah had been trained to do with unresponsive people, treating them as present, as aware, as human. The man's temperature rose to 92, 94, 96. His heart rate steadied, his breathing deepened, his color improved from gray-blue towards something closer to alive. Sarah Price appeared intermittently. She wanted to help, but didn't know how. She wanted to do something, but understood the rules meant her hands were tied. She stood in the hallway outside the curtain bay, watching Marcus work, understanding perfectly that he was committing professional suicide in real time and doing it anyway. "How long are you going to keep this up?" she asked quietly at one point. "As long as it takes," Marcus said. He didn't look at her. He was watching the monitors, watching the old man's vital signs, watching the incremental improvement that meant the man was going to survive. Richard Walsh appeared once, saw what was happening, and left without saying anything. That was almost worse than anger. That was the response of a man watching someone else destroy their own career, and calculating whether to intervene or simply let it happen. Tommy brought coffee at 3 a.m, just appeared with 2 cups, set one down beside Marcus, left without saying a word. That small act of solidarity nearly broke Marcus completely. That Tommy, young and idealistic and just starting his career, would risk being associated with this. The man's eyes flickered at 4 a.m. His eyelids fluttered. His mouth moved slightly. He wasn't talking, wasn't awake. But something in his consciousness was stirring. Something was responding to the fact that someone was fighting for him. Marcus spoke to him. "You're safe now," he said. And he meant it with the certainty he didn't actually feel. "You're going to be okay. Someone saw you. Someone cared. You're going to be okay." At 5 a.m, as the first light was starting to break across the hospital grounds, the man's eyes opened. Just for a moment, just enough to focus on Marcus's face. And in that moment, something passed between them. A recognition, a gratitude, a kind of understanding that didn't require words. Then the man's eyes closed again. But his breathing was steady now. His color was good. His vital signs were stable. He was going to live. And Marcus was about to be fired. Marcus didn't sleep. He couldn't. He sat beside the man's bed for the rest of his shift, monitoring, adjusting, watching the hospital wake up around him, watching the day shift arrive, watching people come in and out, some of them knowing what he'd done, all of them understanding the implications. At 8:45 a.m., Richard Walsh appeared with 2 HR representatives. He didn't look angry. He looked professional, resigned. "Mr. Reed," he said, "we need to have a conversation about last night's incident." Marcus nodded. He understood. This was it, the moment everything changed. He stood up, left the curtained bay, and followed them to a conference room. He knew what was coming. He'd known since the moment he turned off the radio. But first, there was one more thing he needed to do. He walked back to the man's bay, pulled the curtain open one more time, and looked at the stranger he'd saved. The man was sleeping peacefully now, peaceful in a way that suggested he understood on some level that someone had chosen to fight for him. Marcus placed his hand on the man's shoulder for just a moment. "Be well," he whispered. "Be safe, be alive. That's all I needed to know." Then he turned round and walked toward his own ending. The conference room was set up like a courtroom for a trial that had already been decided. Richard Walsh sat at the head of the table. 2 HR representatives flanked him. Sarah Price sat to the side, visibly uncomfortable, clearly wishing she was anywhere else. Marcus was alone. No union representative because hospital security wasn't unionized. No legal counsel because he couldn't afford one. No witnesses except the people who'd already decided his fate. Mr. Reed, Richard Walsh began pulling out a folder. "We're here regarding the incident at the east entrance last night at approximately 11:45 p.m. Marcus said nothing. He learned long ago that silence was sometimes the best response to systems designed to trap you. "You brought an unregistered individual into this facility," Walsh continued. "Without authorization, without verification of insurance, without approval from any attending physician or operations manager. You accessed medical supplies against protocol. You interfered with proper intake procedures. These are termination-level violations." "He was dying," Marcus said. The protocol is for when you have a choice," Marcus interrupted. "We didn't have a choice. He would have died. That mattered more than the protocol." Sarah Price flinched at his words. Her hands gripped the table. She wanted to speak but couldn't figure out how. Richard Walsh pulled out the documentation. "These are the facts," he said. "These are the violations. This is your termination paperwork. You'll receive final pay information about your separation agreement and a non-disparagement clause that means you cannot discuss this incident with media or public." Marcus looked at the papers. He understood what they meant. He understood that his voice, his story, his version of events was being erased, being classified as a liability. "What about the man?" Marcus asked. "The one who was dying." "He'll be transferred to county hospital once he's stable," Sarah said quietly. "It's in his best interest given our policy regarding unregistered individuals." Marcus understood. The man he'd saved was going to be transferred away, going to lose access to the hospital that had tried to deny him care, going to be processed through the county system that was already overburdened and understaffed. "Sign here," Richard said, placing the papers in front of him. Marcus didn't sign, he just stood up. "You should have known your place," Richard said, and Marcus understood that this line had been prepared, had been practiced, had been delivered to other people who'd broken the rules before. It was the institution's answer to anyone who tried to do something outside their designated role. Marcus walked out of the conference room. Security was standing by the entrance, escort detail ready. He walked out of the hospital the same way he'd walked in that morning, with dignity intact, with his choices made, with his future now uncertain. But that wasn't quite how it happened, because Richard Walsh, for reasons that had to do with establishing precedent, insisted that the termination be announced to the staff. So that afternoon, while Marcus was sitting in his apartment trying to figure out how he was going to explain to Darius that everything had changed, an announcement was made. in the break room, on the hospital bulletin board, through email. The message was the same. Marcus Reed's security guard had been terminated for violating Protocol 427 and accessing hospital resources without authorization. The reason given was that he'd brought an unregistered individual into the facility without proper approval. The message that was conspicuously absent was the reason why. That a man had been dying. That Marcus had chosen to save him. All that staff members knew was that the security guard, who'd always been professional, who'd always been competent, who'd always been present and helpful, had suddenly violated the rules and been fired. Some of them understood what had actually happened. Some of them knew about the dying man. Some of them knew that Marcus's choice had been moral and correct and necessary. But none of them said anything. None of them questioned the protocol. None of them asked why the hospital was designed in a way that made compassion against the rules. Tommy watched the news spread through the hospital. He watched Diane's face when she realized that the woman who'd issued the protocol compliance order, Sarah, was now the one who had to explain Marcus's firing to her subordinates. He watched the institution move forward as if nothing had happened, as if a black man's livelihood could be erased from the official record just by removing his name from the roster. And Tommy understood, in the way young people sometimes do when they see injustice in real time, that this was what the system was designed to do. To make compassion impossible. To punish people who tried to do the right thing. To ensure that kindness remained invisible and individual choices remained powerless against institutional structures. Marcus sat in his apartment that evening. Darius doing homework at the kitchen table, trying to maintain routine even though Marcus's entire world had just shifted. The bills were spread in front of him. Electric, water, phone, rent, Darius's school tuition. The math was brutal and simple. Without his salary, he had $2,800 and no income. Even living as cheaply as possible, that would last maybe 3 weeks before the real problem started. He thought about calling Elena. He thought about calling his church community. He thought about asking for help. Instead, he sat with the weight of it. He sat with the knowledge that he'd made a choice, that the choice had been necessary, that the cost was real. "Uncle Marcus," Darius's small voice came from across the table. "Are you okay?" Marcus looked at his nephew, at the boy who was learning to read stress the way animals read weather, at the child who understood on some level that his security was always conditional. "I'm okay," Marcus said. And he meant it. He meant that the action had been right, even if the consequences were hard. He meant that some things were more important than being okay. "Something happened at work," he said. "I'm not going to be working there anymore." Darius's face showed the cascade of realizations that followed that statement. Moving, school change, the comfortable routine ending. "Did you do something bad?" Darius asked. "I did something good," Marcus said. But the people in charge didn't see it that way. He pulled Darius into a hug, and his nephew understood the way 8-year-olds sometimes do, that the world wasn't always designed to reward good things, that systems could be built to make kindness dangerous, that loving and protecting someone sometimes meant accepting loss. The hospital moved forward. The man Marcus had saved was stable and scheduled for transfer to County Hospital by the following morning. Nobody at Cornerstone asked his name. Nobody filed a report about his recovery. Nobody acknowledged that a human being had been saved by an employee who'd broken protocol. The incident was closed. Professionally, financially, it was already being spun as a positive. Richard Walsh filed a report celebrating Protocol 427's successful implementation. He noted that the number of uninsured emergency admissions had remained low. He noted that the hospital's margins had improved. He noted that unauthorized use of hospital resources had been properly addressed. Victoria Stanton read this report in her office. She understood, reading between the lines of corporate language, that what it actually said was simple. We fired a black man for saving someone's life, and the system worked perfectly. She pulled up the security footage on her monitor. She watched Marcus enter the rain. She watched him carry the old man through the doors. She watched him work through the night, providing care that protocol forbade. And she watched her entire philosophy collapse in the face of what she was seeing. Marcus hadn't been reckless. He'd been skilled. He'd been knowledgeable. He'd broken the rules consciously, understanding the cost, accepting the consequence. He'd done the thing that was right, and the institution had punished him for it. Victoria began very slowly to understand that something about her work, her life, her choices had been fundamentally wrong. It took Victoria 3 days to get up the courage to access the intake files. She found them without difficulty. Hospital administration was her domain after all. She pulled the records of the unnamed man from the night of the incident. The man was still listed as unregistered. No insurance information, no contact information, no identification. But there was something odd. A notation in the file. A familiar name written in another hand's notation. Victoria searched the name in the hospital's database. And then she searched it in the broader internet. And then she found herself staring at a Wikipedia page. Charles Hartley, 72 years old, philanthropist, real estate developer, board member of 3 major hospitals, including one where Victoria had colleagues, chairman of the board of a non-profit that served vulnerable populations. Charles Hartley, who'd been reported missing 2 weeks ago. Charles Hartley, who'd been found dying on the concrete outside Cornerstone Medical Center. Charles Hartley, who'd been saved by a security guard who'd been immediately fired for breaking protocol. Victoria sat back in her chair. The weight of what she'd just learned was enormous, not the fact that the man was powerful, though that was certainly an element. The fact that the man was someone who spent his life trying to help people that systems had abandoned. The man Marcus had saved was someone who dedicated his life to the exact opposite of what Protocol 427 represented. And Marcus had saved him without knowing who he was, had valued his life not because of his status or his wealth, but simply because a human being mattered. Victoria began very slowly to understand what she'd done wrong, not just in firing Marcus, but in building a system where compassion was impossible, where kindness was classified as insubordination, where the price of doing the right thing was your entire livelihood. She placed a call to a number she found in the hospital database. An old colleague, someone she knew worked in hospital administration. "I need to find someone," she said quietly. "A man named Charles Hartley. I need to know where he is and how to reach him." The conversation that followed would change everything. Charles Hartley regained consciousness fully on the 4th day. The morphine was wearing off. The hypothermia was addressed. His body was responding to treatment. What responded most slowly was his memory. He remembered cold. He remembered pain. He remembered feeling like his body was shutting down, consciousness fading, the sensation of dying. And he remembered hands that had carried him, hands that had helped him. "Who brought me in?" he asked the nurse. His voice was hoarse, but present. He was alive. He was going to be okay. "A security guard," the nurse said, "from Cornerstone Medical Center. He brought you in the night you collapsed." Charles closed his eyes. He remembered the rain. He remembered the moment before everything went dark. Someone standing in the downpour, carrying him, choosing him, saving him. "His name," Charles asked. "Marcus Reed, though he doesn't work there anymore." Charles opened his eyes. He understood in the way powerful people do that something significant had just been communicated to him, that there was a story here, that something consequential had happened. He reached for his phone. Marcus's phone rang while he was sitting at his kitchen table updating his resume. The number was unfamiliar. He almost didn't answer. "Mr. Reed," a voice came through, older, steady, authoritative in a way that suggested a lifetime of people listening when he spoke. "My name is Charles Hartley. I'm calling because you saved my life 4 days ago." Marcus's hand went numb. The voice made sense now. The memory connected to a name. Charles Hartley, the man lying on the concrete, the man who'd been dying. "Sir," Marcus managed. "I've been learning about what happened after you brought me in," Charles said. "I've learned that you were fired. I've learned that the hospital terminated your employment as a consequence of saving my life. I've learned that you understood the cost and did it anyway." Marcus didn't know what to say. "I want to understand why," Charles said. "I want to know what possessed a man to break every rule, risk his entire livelihood, for a stranger lying in the rain." Marcus thought about how to answer this. He thought about Darius. He thought about his brother. He thought about systems designed to make compassion impossible. "Because he was human," Marcus said finally. "Because some things matter more than protocols. Because your life mattered." Charles was quiet for a long moment. "I want to meet with you," he said. "I want to understand this more completely. Can you come to the hospital tomorrow 9 in the morning, the main entrance?" "Why?" Marcus asked. "Because what you did deserves to be witnessed," Charles said. "Because something important happened and it should not be erased. Because I have resources and I intend to use them." The phone call ended. Marcus sat in the silence of his apartment, understanding that something had shifted, not knowing what, but understanding that the story wasn't over yet. Charles Hartley spent that evening making phone calls. He called his lawyer. He called people in his network. He called Victoria Stanton directly. "I know what happened," he said when she answered. "I know you tried to protect the protocol. I know you built a system. I know you're beginning to understand what that system actually does." Victoria listened. "I want to tell you a story," Charles said. 40 years ago, I was a young man with a family business, and no particular interest in helping anyone but myself. Then my father died. He died in a hospital that had policies like Protocol 427. He died because he was poor, and the system didn't value his life. And I made a decision. I was going to spend the rest of my life trying to make sure that other people's fathers, other people's brothers, didn't die because they couldn't afford to be saved. Victoria listened. "Then I almost died outside your hospital, and a black security guard, a man making probably less than what I spend on a suit, chose to break your protocol and save my life. He knew it would cost him. He did it anyway. And the institution you helped design fired him for it." Victoria said nothing. "I'm going to fix this," Charles said. "Not just for Marcus, but to show that institutions can be changed. That systems designed around profit can be redesigned around people. That the thing you've built can be unmade and rebuilt into something better." Victoria understood. She was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I'll help." Charles and Victoria planned over the next 24 hours. They gathered documentation, security footage, intake records, protocol enforcement data, financial incentive information. They contacted the hospital board chair, a different man than Richard Walsh, someone Victoria actually respected. They explained what had happened. They provided evidence. They contacted journalists. They arranged for media presence. They prepared not just to vindicate Marcus, but to expose and dismantle the system that had forced his choice to be an act of heroic sacrifice, rather than basic human decency. Marcus, meanwhile, was job searching, sending resumes to other hospitals, getting rejections, understanding that he'd been effectively blacklisted, that the non-disparagement clause meant he couldn't explain what had actually happened, that his career in hospital security was over. He didn't know yet that his entire life was about to change. Charles called Marcus directly the evening before the meeting. His voice was stronger now, his body recovering. I want you to come to Cornerstone tomorrow, Charles said. 9 in the morning. Main entrance. Wear formal clothes if you have them. I want you to look like the director you're about to become. Sir, Marcus said, completely confused. I don't understand what's happening. You will, Charles said. You will understand completely. The line went dead. Marcus looked at Darius, who was already asleep in the bedroom. He looked at his apartment. He looked at his life, which seemed to be standing at another crossroads. He pulled out his only formal shirt. He polished his shoes. He prepared himself for something he couldn't anticipate. He didn't sleep. He sat up all night, thinking about the old man in the rain, thinking about the choice he'd made, thinking about consequences and compassion and the way his life had fractured the moment he turned off the radio. He wasn't prepared for what was coming, but he was ready to face it. The atrium of Cornerstone Medical Center was transformed overnight. Journalists were setting up cameras. Board members were assembling. Hospital staff was gathering, some knowing what was about to happen, most entirely confused. Marcus arrived at 8:55 a.m., overdressed in his single formal shirt, shoes polished to shine. Dignity held like armor even though he was terrified. Charles Hartley walked in at 9 a.m., still moving carefully, still recovering, but walking with the kind of presence that made the room pay attention. Victoria Stanton walked beside him. Richard Walsh was not present. The hospital board chair had warned him not to be. This was not a trial. This was a reckoning. Sarah Price was present, standing in the back, her face showing the cascade of realizations about what was about to happen. Tommy was present, young and witnessing, understanding that he was about to see justice move in a direction he thought impossible just days before. The journalists had their cameras ready. The board members were arranged in formal lines, and in the center of the atrium, two men, one black, one white, one who'd been invisible, one who'd been all-powerful, were about to demonstrate that systems could be changed. Charles Hartley didn't give a speech. He simply stood in the center of the atrium and spoke. 2 weeks ago, he said, I was reported missing. I'd been traveling. I'd been careless. I'd been out in weather I shouldn't have been in. And I collapsed outside this hospital with severe hypothermia. My body was shutting down. Without immediate intervention, I would have died. He paused. But someone saw me, a man named Marcus Reed, a black man working in a position of security, a man who'd learned that Protocol 4270 protocol, approved by this hospital's board, implemented by its administrators, would have meant I'd be directed to county services rather than admitted to this hospital. He looked directly at the cameras. Marcus Reed broke that protocol. He carried me inside. He provided medical care that protocol forbade. He saved my life knowing with complete certainty that doing so would cost him his job. Charles pointed to Marcus. And the next morning the hospital fired him. The atrium was completely silent. I am Charles Hartley. I have spent 40 years trying to undo the damage of hospitals that value money more than life. I have spent 40 years fighting for people like Marcus. People like the man I was lying on that concrete. People who institutions have decided aren't worth saving. He looked at Victoria. I want to acknowledge that this board member, Victoria Stanton, came to me asking questions about what happened. She looked at the footage. She investigated. She chose to see what the system had tried to erase. And she has committed to helping fix what is broken here. Charles turned back to the room. Effective immediately, Richard Walsh is fired. The investigation into Protocol 427 is expanding. The policies that made it acceptable to let a human being die on concrete are being dismantled. And there is a new position being created, Director of Humanitarian Operations. And Marcus Reed is being offered that position. The atrium erupted, not in cheers but in gasps, in the sound of people understanding that the story they thought was finished actually had an ending they couldn't have predicted. The hours that followed were a cascade of consequences and changes. Richard Walsh, confronted with evidence and Charles Hartley's public condemnation, resigned before he could be formally terminated. His severance was expensive, but the board chair made clear this man had built a system where compassion was impossible, and he wouldn't be allowed to leave quietly. Protocol 427 was suspended immediately. Pending full review, Victoria Stanton was asked to chair a committee on hospital ethics, a role she accepted with the seriousness of someone who understood she'd gotten something fundamentally wrong and was determined to fix it. Sarah Price requested a transfer to a different floor. But before she transferred, she called Marcus. "I'm sorry," she said. "I was afraid. I should have been brave." Marcus forgave her because he understood that systems trapped people, that protocols were designed to make kindness expensive, that she'd been complicit in a way that was understandable if not right. Tommy was promoted to assistant supervisor. He became the keeper of Marcus's lesson, that institutions could be changed from within, that doing the right thing was possible even when systems discouraged it, that sometimes the invisible people in the back of the organization saw truth that the powerful never would. Marcus was officially offered the position of Director of Humanitarian Operations. The salary was substantial. The authority was real. He would oversee how the hospital approached care for uninsured, vulnerable, marginalized people. He would, in essence, be tasked with dismantling the very system he'd broken protocol to resist. He accepted immediately, and he called Darius. "Something happened," he said to his nephew. "I need you to know that sometimes when you do the right thing, good things follow. Sometimes the universe responds to kindness." Darius, 8 years old and already wise, listened to his uncle, and he understood that his uncle had been right, that some things mattered more than safety, that love sometimes meant being willing to lose everything. 6 weeks later, Marcus walked the corridors of Cornerstone Medical Center wearing a dark suit, an ID badge that read Director of Humanitarian Operations. His worn notebook was still in his jacket pocket, still full of notes, still growing, still guiding him. The policies had changed. Uninsured patients now had a 72-hour window before being transferred elsewhere. Emergency medical care was no longer contingent on proof of insurance. The financial incentive structure that had made cruelty profitable had been dismantled. It had taken work, it had taken political capital. It had taken Marcus, Charles, and Victoria working together to convince a board that had been comfortable with the old system that something different was possible. But it had been done. 7 new protocols had been implemented, all focused on compassionate care, all focused on the principle that human life mattered more than margin percentages. Marcus had hired experienced people from county hospitals, places that served the poor, the vulnerable, the marginalized. He'd learned from institutions that already understood how to provide excellent care in resource-limited environments. The changes weren't revolutionary in design. They were revolutionary only in being implemented by an institution that had previously worked against them. One night, Marcus encountered a new crisis. A person collapsed outside the hospital in bad weather, exactly mirroring the original incident. Marcus went out to meet them. This time there was no protocol violation, no risk, no consequence except the immediate help. He brought the person inside. He ensured care. He made sure they were treated with dignity. And this time the system worked for them instead of against them. Victoria had completely transformed her understanding of power. She'd gone from seeing compassion as a liability to understanding it as the entire point. She chaired the new ethics committee. She fought for policies that other hospital administrators resisted. She became someone who used her power to protect people instead of exclude them. Charles visited regularly. He and Marcus had developed a friendship that transcended the initial rescue. They ate lunch together. They talked about the work being done. They became unexpectedly advocates for each other. Tommy became the most vocal young security recruit in the hospital, telling the story of what happened. teaching people that protocols could be wrong, that systems could change, that doing the right thing was possible, even when institutions discouraged it. Darius started spending weekends at the hospital. He'd help in small ways. He'd see his uncle respected by everyone he met. He'd understand viscerally that his uncle had done something important, something right, something that mattered. 8 months after the original incident, rain fell again. Not the same rain, but the kind of rain that felt like echo, heavy, wind-driven, the kind that made you think about vulnerable people trying to survive outdoors. Marcus was home that night. He saw the weather report. He thought about the people outside. He put on his jacket. He didn't go as a security guard. He didn't go as a director. He simply went as a person who understood that systems change slowly. That kindness was still sometimes expensive. That vulnerability was still all around them, waiting for someone to care. He went to the east entrance, the same entrance where Charles Hartley had been dying. He found a young person, middle-aged, shivering, without shelter or resources. "Come inside," Marcus said. "We have help. You're going to be okay." The person looked at him confused, expecting to be turned away, expecting to be directed to county services. "There's no paperwork required," Marcus said. "Just come inside." As he walked the person into the hospital, Marcus thought about everything that had happened, about the choice he'd made in that moment, turning off the radio, walking into the rain, choosing compassion over safety. The cost had been real. The consequence had been devastating. The moment when he understood his entire livelihood was being erased had been one of the hardest moments of his life. But it had also been the moment that changed everything. Not just for him, but for the institution, for the people who worked there, for everyone who came seeking care and found against the odds that someone valued their life. Systems change slowly. They don't change because one person does one right thing. But they can change when people are willing to do the right thing, when they're willing to speak about it publicly, when people with power choose to listen and act. Marcus Reed had spent 2 years being invisible at Cornerstone Medical Center. He had spent 2 years making a system work perfectly for the people who designed it. And then he'd spent one night breaking that system, because a human being's life was more important than the rules. The institution had tried to erase him, but Charles Hartley had been watching. Victoria Stanton had been watching, and Tommy Green had been watching. And sometimes when enough people are watching, when enough people understand what happened and choose to say it aloud, the institution can't maintain the lie. Marcus is still the director of humanitarian operations at Cornerstone Medical Center. He still carries his worn notebook. He still checks on vulnerable people outside the hospital in bad weather. He still teaches people like Tommy Green that systems can change, that kindness is possible, that doing the right thing matters even when it costs everything. Darius is 10 years old now. He understands that his uncle is important, that his uncle did something that mattered, that sometimes you have to be willing to sacrifice your own safety to protect someone else's life. And in hospitals across the country, quiet changes are happening. Changes inspired by the story of a black security guard who broke protocol to save a stranger's life. Changes that suggest that if we redesigned our institutions around people instead of profit, around compassion instead of efficiency, we might create systems where kindness wasn't dangerous and doing the right thing didn't cost everything. Sometimes a single moment of courage doesn't just change one person's life. Sometimes it changes the shape of institutions. Sometimes it ripples forward into a future where people see each other, value each other, choose each other across every boundary we've been taught to respect. That's what happened when Marcus Reed stepped into the rain. That's what happened when one person decided that some things mattered more than safety. That's what happened when we finally stopped looking away. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the people you walk past every day, the ones the world tells you don't matter, then maybe it's worth sharing. Not for us, but for them. Because somewhere out there right now, someone is doing the right thing and getting punished for it. And maybe all they need is to know that somebody sees them, If you're that person, we see you. Subscribe our channel for more stories like this. Drop a comment and tell us, have you ever been punished for doing the right thing? We read every single one. And if this story hit you in the chest the way it hit us, pass it along. You never know who needs to hear it.